are so excited that Kathleen Rooney is here today. Kathleen Rooney has experiences. I thought a lot about how to introduce her because she's got such an incredible background. She's written more than 9 books of poetry and nonfiction, ranging from Oprah to Renee Magritte. She's a poet, she's a feminist, she's a professor, she was a US Senate aide, a model, a library page, a bookstore seller, and a publisher. And her characters, said one, have a genuine sense of grace, fluent in the most subtle of feeling, the most compassionate of speculations. So she writes not just across gender and ethnicity and age, but species, and is heartbreakingly and sharply funny. Kathleen, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the library, and thanks to everyone for being here. I am going to sort of break down how this will go. In my one of my other hats is that I'm a college professor at DePaul University, and so I always like to start any presentation with a map of where we're going to go. So today our route is going to be that I'm going to start by doing a short slideshow that has to do with my most recent novel, where I do write across species, Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey. So I'll start sharing my screen in a minute. And then I'll pause there for questions, or if I would say as I'm going, you have a question, throw it in the chat. I won't stop, but I'll pause between sections because I don't know about you, but I don't always remember things like I want to. I'll think of a question and then it'll be time and I'll forget. So if that's you, just drop it in the chat. And then after that, I will talk a little bit about my previous novel, Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk, and sort of how I wrote that, because I do think the books are connected. And then at that point, there will be plenty of time for general questions, comments. I'm happy to talk about the writing life, how to get published, poetry. I also run a small press, so anything you want to talk about, I'm here for an hour. So that's the route. So thank you for coming on this journey with me. And I'm going to begin now by sharing my screen. And so you can see my slides, hopefully, theoretically. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see it? You're good? Excellent, thank you. So a question that I think a lot of writers get is, where do you get your ideas? How did you decide to write this book? And I love that question. And I think the answer is different for every writer. But for me, usually it's kind of a twofold process. There's one thing that is sort of already inside of my heart or my imagination, something that I already find fascinating and have been thinking about for years. And then the second thing is usually something that comes from outside and sort of lights that fire, right? It's the spark that sets that kindling a flame. And that's kind of the case with this book. And I think, what you need to know first before I jump in is just kind of the elevator pitch for the book is in the title, right? It's Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey. And it's based on these 2 real figures, one of whom, as you can see in this first slide, is a pigeon named Cher Ami, and one of whom is a soldier named Charles Whittlesey. And they were real, and they became incredibly famous in the fall of 1918. In October of 1918, they were part of this group of men called the Lost Battalion, who advanced along the Western Front in this huge push, right? It's like 1 month before the war was going to end, but they didn't know. And the order was everyone along the line was supposed to go forward until the last man dropped. The idea being they were going to overwhelm the Germans and finally end this war. What happened is Charles Whittlesey, who Cher Ami was part of that group, was the only group of soldiers along the entire line to do that. And as a result, they got stuck in what was called the pocket because they were surrounded, right? They were in this little pocket surrounded by the Germans. And so once that happened, things went downhill quickly. The Germans, of course, were trying to kill them. They didn't have food, they didn't have water because they were told it was going to be a quick advance. They were going to be in, they were going to be out, it was going to be fine. And then worst of all, excuse me, partway into this ordeal, the Americans started shelling them. It was a friendly fire incident, which of course was unintentional. They thought they were shelling the Germans, but they were shelling their own men. And so that's the story. It's a harrowing story, but I think, I've tried to write about it in a way that it's sad, but it's also got moments of humor. There are love stories. So basically, this is the story of like how I, Kathleen Rooney in Chicago, who never experienced World War I, who's never been a pigeon, came to write this story. So I will, there we go. So as it says here, this is kind of that first thing. I've had this sort of inside of my head ever since I was little. I've been really fascinated with World War I, and you can kind of see some of the numbers. And I think numbers are useful, but they only get you so far. 20 million deaths, 21 million wounded worldwide, with a lot of those deaths actually being civilians. And I think, there was something about that, as soon as I learned about World War I, just the magnitude of that, and trying even as a kid to wrap my brain around what would cause the entire globe to participate in that kind of massive butchery. It haunted me. So I wanted to explore it. Part of why I wanted to explore it, and part of why, you might be thinking, why would a little kid know about World War I? And that's because my own dad was in the military. And so I grew up in a household where he was sometimes teaching military history classes to his fellow soldiers. That was one of the things that he did. And so there would always be all these books, and I would always be watching, what he was preparing to teach. And, so I learned about that from him. But then I also, as I got older, I'm a poet too. And if anyone's a poet or wants to talk about poetry, we can talk about that too later. I fell in love with the poetry of Wilfred Owen, who's the guy on the right, who some of you certainly probably recognize. And then, I don't know if anybody, revealing my sort of cheesy television tastes, if anybody watched the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, it was this short-lived but like really well done TV show from the early 90s. And you can see here, this is Indiana Jones as a young man, and he fought in World War I. And I think, as silly as it sounds, the show did a good job impressing on me how nightmarish trench warfare would have been. And then it's not a poetry reading, so I'm not gonna pause and read this, but I would say this is a poem. If you're into World War I poetry, I would say look it up and enjoy it on your own. But this poem, Rain by Edward Thomas, is an example of how I sort of fell in love with this conflict, partly because the men who fought it were from all backgrounds, all walks of life. The military hadn't quite become so stratified. I think it's unfortunate nowadays that anyone has to fight in a war. I think I've written an anti-war novel, but I think one of the things that is sad about the military nowadays is how many people in it are in it as almost like a last resort, or they're under-resourced and think this is what I have to do to better myself. But in World War I, you still had this upper class group of men, like one of them who, they went to Oxford, they went to Cambridge. My guy, Charles Whittlesey, was a Harvard educated lawyer. And they still, believed it was somehow their duty to go fight in these wars. And you can see just from the dates, right? March 3rd, 1878, April 9th, 1917, he didn't make it, right? He went to war and he wrote all these amazing poems about it, but he was killed in April of 1917. And, there was still over a year of war to go at that point. So something about that, I think, also really hit me with the tragedy of the loss. And then personally, I'm here in Chicago, but I grew up in the western suburbs of Chicago. Lots of them out there, but my suburb was Downers Grove, and I went to Downers Grove North High School. And my dad, like I said, he's a veteran, and so he's in the American Legion. And his post is post 80. And that post is pictured here. You can see it. That's what it looks like. But to the right of the post it says A.B. Burns. And this is Alexander Bradley Burns, who the post is named after. And, whenever I would go hang out at the Legion with my dad, for like bingo night or for parties or whatever, this picture is the picture that you walk under. You walk into the entryway, and to get to the bar, to get to the, meeting hall, you have to look at Alec. And, the Post website explains that he was the first of our boys from Downers Grove to make the supreme sacrifice. And he was killed by shrapnel in 1918. And, something about seeing that when I was in high school, and just thinking about how someone who was so close to my age would be killed like that really stuck with me. Shifting gears, right? So that's how World War I became sort of a fascination of mine. But I'm also very fascinated with birds. I don't know if other people, I feel like bird watching has had a real bump during the pandemic, and I see why they're very appealing. But I always loved pigeons. And I know pigeons are not the most popular birds in the world. I get really sad when I hear people call them rats with wings or say that they're dirty, because they're actually really, really intelligent animals. And as someone who grew up in the suburbs, anytime I went to the city, I would see pigeons and I would know that I was in an urban environment and I was going to have a good time. And I think part of it, I don't know if there's any Mary Poppins fans, but this is from Mary Poppins. And there's this famous scene with the woman who's outside of St. Paul's Cathedral, right? Mary Poppins takes the Banks children downtown, and they encounter this woman who sings the Feed the Birds song. So I think that's why I didn't grow up with like the fear or hatred of pigeons that a lot of people in my generation seem to have now. And this is me with some of my pigeon friends. My sister Beth is a photographer, and she took this picture of me. This is the pigeons in Daly Plaza, who are really friendly and wonderful and will obviously eat out of your hand. And then, so those are the things that were in me, right? My love of World War I, my love of pigeons. Enter the external match that sort of lit the flame of why I would write this novel. So at DePaul, I teach a class called Drift and Dream, Writer as Urban Walker. And some of you, if you know Lillian, right? My other novel is called Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk. And so I love walking. And so I had this student back in 2013, Brian Michich, and he turned in this poem that had this almost throwaway line. The image was of an older gentleman who was sitting on a park bench and he was surrounded by pigeons. But then Brian wrote, "This was no Cher Ami story. Look it up." And I did. And it was funny. He was kind of kidding me because I always, always, always tell my students, look it up, right? We always have our phones. If we don't know something, we have no excuse for not looking it up. So I did. And when I did, I was amazed to hear this story that I sort of began with, this tale of the Lost Battalion, which was 554 men who were led by Charles Whittlesey. And here you can see him in his sort of more field uniform, right? He's got his helmet and he's got his outdoor gear. And like I said, in October of 1918, they did this thing where they were the only ones to successfully advance, and they kind of became the victims of their own success and of this friendly fire incident. And then the more I read, I mean, this is just me on Wikipedia, right? I just did what anyone else would do. I just Googled it. And then I started to learn about how communications were so difficult in World War I. And something I already knew, because my dad taught about it, but he would always point out how one of the things about World War I is that they were fighting with these very simultaneously old school tactics like trenches and cavalry advances, stuff they had done since the Civil War, since Napoleon. But they also had all this technology that made it really lethal, right? They had the machine gun, they had barbed wire, they had tanks, they had landmines. So pigeons really kind of exist at this weird intersection between the old technology and the new technology, because in 1914, Marconi was working on the radio. They had radio, but it would only go one way, right? Radio could only broadcast, it couldn't receive. I mean, they would develop that really quickly into the early 20s, but at the time of World War I, only one way. And they had telephones, of course, but it was big, clunky analog technology. And so both sides were always trying to cut the cables and cut the cords of the enemy. And in fact, Alec Bradley Burns, who was the American Legion Post guy, he was killed by shrapnel in the process of trying to fix the telephone wires. So that was a big issue. And then finally, they had runners, they had men whose job it was to run from the front to the rear. But as you can imagine, that was incredibly treacherous and they got killed and injured all the time. So as you can see in this picture, one of the most reliable ways of communicating was pigeons, trained homing pigeons who would carry messages. And so Cher Ami enters the story by being their last remaining pigeon during this terrible incident, right? They were down to their last bird. And so she carried the message as you can see here, that saved them from the friendly fire incident. So it's awful. Hundreds of these men died anyway, but the fact that any of them survived has a lot to do with the fact that Cher Ami carried this message. So here she is. It's a pretty sweet picture, but I think a pretty sad picture. This is her with her one of her medals for gallantry. As you can see here, pigeons, some of you might know this, they're incredible flyers. They're so fast, and she flew 25 miles in 25 minutes, and 194 men were able to be saved thanks to her. But something I learned is that both sides were pretty vicious about pigeons. They were, they both had snipers to shoot down any pigeon. Americans would shoot the German pigeons, Germans would shoot the American pigeons. The Germans even had falcons, falconers, birds of prey, and they would train the falcons to attack the pigeons out of the sky. And so she was badly injured. She got shot through the chest. She lost an eye, and her one leg was hanging by a tendon. And so usually, and this is part of why I wanted to write about this, so many animals got used in World War I, just massive slaughter of horses and dogs and birds in the service of this human war. But they knew that Cher Ami was so important, right? She finished her flight, she landed, she dinged the bell, she delivered her message, she stopped the artillery. The medics actually worked to save her. And they made her a little wooden leg, which I think is just one of these heartbreaking details, so that she could kind of hobble around, because they couldn't save her actual leg. And so she got the Croix de Guerre because the French have always been more willing to give animals medals. And then General Pershing knew that what she had done was so important and that medals are good for morale. So he just made up an honor for her and just gave her a medal. So Whittlesey too, obviously, was an incredibly heroic person, just keeping his men's endurance and bravery up. And so he also got the Medal of Honor, the Croix de Guerre, the Legion of Honor. And when he came back to the States, he became really popular and in demand as a speaker. And he had what I think we would today very, very clearly identify as PTSD and survivor's guilt. He never got over, the fact that he survived and so many men under his command didn't, and he really blamed himself, and it was really awful. And like I mentioned, he even starred in this movie, the 1919 version of The Lost Battalion. And this is Cher Ami toward the end of her life. You can see her. She was actually in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. So she was, a Jersey bird for the last few months of her life. But she did die of her wounds just a few months later, right? She was wounded in October. She made it until June of 1919. And what's interesting is that they, obviously she wouldn't carry messages anymore, but they toured her around to school groups and veterans groups as a way of kind of making people feel better about the war. Basically, she sort of was turned into a propaganda piece. And this is a spoiler, so if you don't want to know what happened to Whittlesey, turn me off. But sadly, he also did not last long after the war. Like I said, he was pretty traumatized by it. And he was also frustrated because when he would give these speeches, he would try to advocate for peace and say, if the Americans met a German on the road, they would give him a cigarette. We don't hate the Kaiser, we want peace. And unfortunately, the atmosphere in America at that point was still pretty bloodthirsty, and people didn't want to hear him talk about that. So he got really dispirited. So he bought himself a ticket on this Havana-bound trip called the Taloa, right after he participated in the ceremony of the unknown soldier at Arlington. And he jumped off the ship. He took his own life by leaping into the ocean. And I think that's one of the things that struck me is how courteous that was. It was inconvenient for the ship for a day, when they looked for him, but he didn't want to leave a mess for anyone to find him. And he paid his rent. He told his landlady to cash the check. He left all his law cases in good order. He left the surrender notice that he refused, right? The Germans kept asking him to surrender and he said no. He left that to his second in command, George McMurtry. And then what was wild to me is that Cher Ami was sent to the Smithsonian to be taxidermied. So obviously Whittlesey's body lost in the ocean, but Cher Ami was so important that they stuffed her. And when they stuffed her, they discovered that they'd been identifying her this whole time as a male bird, but she was a female. And I thought that was interesting too, this misgendering, and that I think still we think, you know, when we think of heroes, I think the mind reaches more quickly for a male hero. And here was Cher-Ami being this female war hero. I just thought that was unusual. And then one of the things I discovered, I'm almost certain that Charles Whittlesey was a closeted gay man. There was lots of euphemisms at the time. He was a confirmed bachelor. No woman was involved. And I can't, you know, he himself was very private. He didn't keep a journal. He never wrote down, I'm gay. But in his suicide note, he did say, I am a misfit by nature and by training, and there's an end of it, which to call yourself a misfit like that in, you know, the late teens, early 20s was essentially to say, I'm gay. And so I don't think he killed himself for that reason, but I think that was a factor. He just didn't have people he could truly be himself with or be open with. And I think the strain of all of these things was a big factor. And one of the things, as you can see from this poster here, this is a real recruitment poster that was used in America in 1917, just as Woodrow Wilson finally said, okay, we're going to enter the war. And you can kind of see how it's playing on these concerns of masculinity. And so you know, enlist on which side of the window are you? And you see this sort of effete, slender, evening attired gentleman, right, who's on the inside. And then you see all these like strapping, you know, suntanned outside soldiers. And so I think, you know, part of the pressure to participate in World War I was absolutely based on trying to be a real man. So like I said, this is, you know, the letter that he left to his law partner, John Baird Prynne. They met at Harvard. They were Wall Street lawyers, mostly working on contracts. And so to me, the fact that, you know, this was a true facet of his nature that in his era wouldn't have been explored, it seemed like a good thing to put in the novel. And, you know, as I kind of wrap up this portion, this is a picture just to go back in Whit's life. This is him when he was an undergrad. And like I said, I teach at DePaul. So this is Whit when he was the age that a lot of my students are, right? Like 22 probably. And in his college yearbook at Williams College, he wrote that the purpose of a college education is learning to judge correctly, to think clearly, and to know the truth, and to attain the faculty of pure delight in the beautiful. And that, you know, it's hard for me to read that and not cry still, even after I've spent so much time on this, because I think, you know, at the time that they were famous, both Cher-Ami and Charles Whittlesey, like everyone knew who they were. I think now in 2021, it's hard to understand just how famous they were, but, you know, school kids would have known about them. You know, everybody from, you know, Manhattan, where they were from, to like Ohio would have known about them because they were such a rare story of heroism in World War I, right? This war was such a mess that it was hard to find a hero. And so the country latched on so hard to these two figures as some kind of symbol of hope. And I think as a writer, and it's something I've done in Lillian and other books too, I'm really interested by how time sorts things out or doesn't, how, you know, things endure or don't. And it was really sad to me that someone like Whit and someone like Cher-Ami, who had made such sacrifices and been so famous in their day, were, you know, at the time I was writing, mostly forgotten. And so that's kind of where I'll leave it, where I say in the end, that's where my sorrow and fascination with World War I lies, is that all these beautiful humans and animals were killed, and, you know, for what? Like, I think it's kind of hard to say. And so that's why I wrote Cher-Ami and Major Whittlesey, and sort of how I went from idea to the execution of the book. So that's the first leg of our journey together. So I'll stop sharing the screen so I can see your faces more. There we go.
We have a question from Marilyn Fultz that I can't begin to pronounce. It's in the chat box.
Oh, yes. Is this area? Yes, it's the Meuse-Argonne in France. Yep, that's correct. So it was that huge sort of Western front. And it was in 1918, that was when the idea was that the Americans were going to try to finally stop this war that had been raging for 4 years and taken so much life. Other questions on this before I segue a little to Lillian? Yeah, Clive. Oh, can you unmute yourself? Sorry.
I'm going to unmute him, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Clyde, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah,
No,
I am. I just wanted to know, did you have the opportunity to talk to many ex-servicemen from that period?
Yeah, great question. I did not, because by the time that, unfortunately, that I was writing, all the World War I people were dead.
Right.
So I didn't. But what's been interesting is that since the book has come out, so my thing was I would have loved to talk to some of Charles Whittlesea's descendants,
Yes.
but he didn't, because of who he was and because of how he died, he obviously didn't leave any kids. Like, he had no direct descendants. So I couldn't, when I was doing my research, I couldn't find anyone. But then the book came out, and I've since heard from 3 Whittlesey relatives, which has been awesome. The first one was based here in Chicago. His name is John Whittlesey Hasbrook. I love him. We've become friends. But in August, when the book came out, he reached out to me over Facebook because he saw the book in a bookstore and it had his name on it, John Whittlesey Hasbrook. And he was like, Whittlesey, that's unusual. So he picked it up, he bought it, and he was reading it. And he just reached out to me over Facebook and said how much he loved it, because when he was a kid, he heard all the time about this relative. Everybody in his family was like, you're related to a war hero. And he was like, honestly, I was, 10, I didn't care. And now all these people are dead, and he wished he knew more. So he read my book and was like happy to learn about this. I think it was his great great uncle or something like that. And fun twist, John Whittlesey Hasbrook is gay, and he loved learning, because when he grew up, he's in his 50s now, and he said, he's fine now, but when he was growing up, it wasn't always so easy to be a gay person. And he loved that this relative, this war hero, was like him. Second relative, less happy story. She reached out to me. Her name's Susan. She lives in DC, and she's another distant relative. And we talked on the phone, and she mostly just wanted to tell me that she was very disappointed. She was upset to learn that Whittlesey was gay, which made me sad, because I don't know why can't a war hero be gay, but it was good to hear from her, even though she didn't love the book. And then the third one was I got to hear from Whit Ingram, who lives in California, so Whittlesey had brothers, and in the book I talk about them, but his brother Melzar, who is one of his closest friends, was this guy's grandfather. And he said that he loved the book because his grandfather Melzar would almost never talk about Charles. Like, he would just say, I love Charles. He was my brother. He was my dear friend. And I've basically never gotten over the fact, that he killed himself. So it's been interesting to get to know people.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Other questions or comments on that part before I can also just jump into Lillian?
I think, why don't we jump in and then
Jane had a question real quick, and then I'll, yeah.
Well, it's not really a question. I just really, I'm dying to read this book, and I read and met you at one of the Booktopias with Lillian Boxfish, and it's one of my favorite books still. I just absolutely love it. And I love how you tie the story in, historically.
Yeah.
And and
thank you.
I'm happy to be here, happy to read all your books.
Thank you. And thank you. I was so happy to see your name pop up, because the Booktopians, you guys are amazing. You're super readers. So thank you so much for being here.
I'm sorry. And we have both of your books at the library. So if you have a union card, call us up and we'll make sure you get it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. So a little bit, I don't have a slideshow, don't worry, this will be more casual, but about Lillian. So this other book, this is the previous novel. And I think it's a good example of how, even though the books are very different, I think writers often have, concerns or things they sort of hover around, or ideas they keep coming back to. And so Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk is also a book whose elevator pitch is kind of in its title, right? It's about this woman, Lillian Boxfish, who takes a walk, but she's based on a real life figure named Margaret Fishback, who really was the highest paid female advertising copywriter in America in the 1930s. And so this real woman was fascinating to me. My best friend from high school, Angela, who I always have to give credit to, told me about her back in 2007. So Angela was getting her library sciences degree. She was down in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and she was working on an internship at Duke University. And you may or may not know this. I didn't know this until Angela told me. But Duke has in America the biggest archive of advertising, copywriting, and marketing materials. And so Angela, back in 2007, got to be the receiving archivist. So she was the first archive professional who worked with Margaret Fishback's papers after her son, Tony, donated them. And so Angela, as she was processing all this material, called me up on the phone and said, "You've got to know about Margaret Fishback." And the reason she said that was, kind of what I said. She was this professional woman who was really, really at the top of her game. She was also a poet. I'm a poet. I love poetry so much. And Margaret Fishback wrote poems, light verse. It appeared in places like The New Yorker and the Saturday Evening Post. And then she also, she wouldn't have called it this because people didn't really talk that way in the 20s and 30s, but she kind of grappled with this idea of, can a woman have it all? Is there such a thing as work-life balance? And I was intrigued by all of that. And so I went down and worked in her materials. And I was also struck by the fact that this woman was so funny. She was hilarious. She kind of invented the concept of using humor in advertising, which I think hearing that in 2021, you kind of think like, what? Because so many ads nowadays are funny or try to be funny. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But Margaret Fishback was the first person who figured out how to make that work, because prior to her, the idea was taking someone's money, for a purchase for a product was like a serious business. It was to be treated with respect, and you didn't want to make it a joke because it's not a joke to part with your money. But Margaret said, like, I get it, but I think we can do it in a way that makes people laugh with us and they know we're not laughing at them. And so she just innovated advertising. And after her, so many ads tried to be funny. And so I thought that was cool. So long story short, I got to be the first non-archivist to work with Margaret's papers. And so, that was back in 2007. And one of the things I like to say when I give kind of a talk about writing and publishing is that a novel, it's different for everyone, but it takes a while, especially if you're doing historical research. You have to do your research and think about what you're doing. And so I learned about Margaret in 2007, and my novel about her didn't come out until 2017. And it's not like I was just sitting there for 10 years working on it. I was doing other stuff, but it took me a while to think about how to tell this woman's story. And the key is, I'm a huge walker. I don't know if anyone else loves walking. I love walking so much. Long walks through the city, like, 10-mile walks through the city. I have this friend, Eric, who's my colleague at DePaul, and sometimes he and I will meet up at 9 in the morning and walk until 5, like it's our job. So credit to him too for being, part of the inspiration for that. So I finally realized after, thinking about Margaret for so long, that if I took Margaret and took my own love of walking and like put them together, that's how I could write a novel, because I think the thing about historical fiction for me is it's great because you have the full story, who these people were, and like, here's how they were born, here's how they lived, here's how they died. But if you don't have a way to make it interesting as a novel, people are gonna get bored. And so to me, giving her a walk was the thing. And so the book does the split structure where you get her flashbacks to, coming to New York City, kind of the Mary Tyler Moore, making her way as a woman in a tough industry. She marries and falls in love, has a kid. But all of this is seen through New Year's Eve, 1984, when she's in Manhattan and she's taking this like 10.5-mile walk on New Year's Eve around the city. And so she, stops and meets different people, and each of the people she meets or the places she passes by kind of sets off, a little reverie, a little reminiscence. And so gradually, as she does this whole walk, you get her whole life story. And so I think, I would never say that Lillian is an autobiographical book, because obviously it's not, but it's a personal book in the sense that I definitely tried to give Lillian some attributes and values that I like to think that I share. So I think, that's another question is sort of writers get is like, how much of it is real or how much of it is not real? And I think for me, it's you know, even when I'm not basing something directly on my own life, I think it's inevitable that some of your own interest and personality kind of finds its way into your characters, or people you know, you start thinking like, who have I known who would be like Charles Whittlesey, or who have I known who would be like Lillian, so I was thinking about my great aunt Georgie for Lillian. Or funny story, like you can see, so this is my kitchen behind me here, you can kind of see. When I was writing Cher Ami, I don't have a real pigeon. I have a wind-up pigeon. Look, it's like a Cher Ami. But while I was writing this book, a pigeon couple moved in under the eaves. They built their little nest under the eaves, and I got to watch them. All the pigeon research that I had done, I got to see them do in real life. Like I won't go on and on because I could turn into a crazy pigeon lady, but the thing that like blew my mind is that pigeons co-parent like equally. So like the mom pigeon will sit on the nest for like all day, and then the dad pigeon will sit on the nest like all night, and they'll take turns so they can each go get food and do what they need to do. And then when the baby pigeons hatch, both of the parents produce pigeon milk. And it's, they're not mammals, obviously, but it comes from their throats, their crops. And so both the mom and the dad feed the baby pigeon. So I just thought that was like amazing when I read about it. And then when they moved in back there, I got to see like, yeah, they really do it. It's a beautiful thing. And, also I feel like I had never seen a baby pigeon before. So I was like, this is so special. I'm seeing a baby pigeon. There's so many adult pigeons, but you never see the babies. And it felt like the universe was like, yeah, write your pigeon novel. So yeah, so that's kind of, I think again with, to wrap up the Lillian, I think that's sort of similar. Obviously, it's a very different story than a war story, but it's a similar story where Lillian, AKA Margaret, in her day was so famous, right? She was very beautiful. If you Google her, she was very tall. She was almost 6 feet tall. She had this red gold hair. She dressed to the nines. And she was like a delight on the society pages. Like the papers loved to write about her because she was so funny and so glamorous. And it was the Great Depression. So she was this sort of like feel good, hope is not lost, human interest story. But by the time I heard about her in 2007, like no one had heard of her. She had gone from being so well known to almost totally forgotten. So again, I'm just fascinated by how that can work. So hopefully I've brought, I try to bring people back in to the light.
I don't know anyone who wouldn't want to be Lillian Boxfish.
Thank you.
She-
Did John have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I've always been intrigued. How did these homing pigeons know where to go?
Mhm.
What's the training process for them? Obviously, they had to be trained in some fashion.
Yeah, great question, John. So yes, so the training process, I go into it in the book and you get to see how it goes. But what's key is like the pigeons, this might sound so obvious, but in order to home, they need to have a home, like a very steady concept of home. And so if you're their trainer, you make sure that the pigeon knows that this one location is where they always should come back to. They're always going to get food, water, shelter, affection, all of that. And then once you establish that, it's a gradual process where you take the young bird out and you take them maybe a mile out at first and you set them free in the air, and then they fly home. And once they do that a few times, you take them out 5 miles, they come home, 10 miles. By the time you get up to like over 10 miles, 20 miles, your bird is pretty set. Like they pretty much are always going to come home unless something bad, like a hawk or a storm or something like that. And that's when, and this is like where pigeon racing happened. And so Cher Ami was originally a racing pigeon. Like that's how they knew she was so good, is that she had been in England. She won a ton of prizes. They knew she was a great bird. But you can, in England, they would take them all the way up to Scotland, so they'd fly like hundreds of miles back. What's crazy is they kind of know how they do it, but they don't fully know. So pigeons have amazing senses of smell. Their eyesight is incredibly good. Their sense of hearing is good. So all of that is a factor in how they make their way back home. But they're not totally sure. They haven't isolated it. They think there might be like magnets in their beak where they can sort of orient themselves to north, so they can always kind of know the direction. But what's the way that they then use them in the war is they would take the birds to France, and that training process I just described had to happen, because you don't want your pigeon flying back to England. You want your pigeon flying back to the place in France. So they would spend a lot of time training them to know that this little loft in the rear, right, where it was safe, where like the generals and everybody were, this is where they had to fly home, so that when they sent them forward with the men, when the men released them from the front, they would always fly back to deliver the message to the people who needed to hear it. And then within that, I mean, it got really elaborate. You know, they would tie the little message canister to their leg, but the message would always be in code, because like I said, the pigeons would get caught or shot or captured. So they didn't want the message to just be something that somebody could scoop up and get private information. Although interestingly, Whittlesea's note, Whittlesea didn't bother to code it because they were in such duress. He just wrote it in English and sent it back because he was like, we're done anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna send it. And it worked.
Thank you.
Great question. Other questions? Marilyn, yeah. Oh, Marilyn, can you unmute yourself, or can we unmute you?
Nope. Marilyn's got to unmute herself.
Okay.
Did you do a lot of World War I research? And if so, where were the places where you found most of the research? What universities or where?
Yeah, great question. Yes, I did. Research was so important. So two places that I recommend, maybe you've been there, but the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, Missouri is amazing. It's just a great museum. It's just very well done, but they have, in addition to their exhibits and things, they just have a ton of material that's researchable. So I thank them in the acknowledgements because they were very, very helpful. And then DePaul University, we don't have here at DePaul a ton of specifically World War I stuff, but a university library was invaluable to me. I was able to, through the interlibrary loan and WorldCat, put in requests for all kinds of stuff that they were able to ship to me. And then DePaul also has a rare books room. And that was really important to me too, because it was in that rare books room, and it's the kind of place where, you know, you can't bring in a pen because they don't want you writing on the books or messing them up. You have to wear white gloves when you touch the books and turn the pages. And they put the books on pillows because they're so fragile. So if you're a book person, it's like going to church. It just feels really special. But I got to go there and use a lot of materials from the Lost Battalion, because what's interesting is, again, they were so famous. A lot of the men who participated wrote books about it, which are now sort of hard to come by because they were more like vanity published. They were not put out by a big mass-produced press. So I got that stuff for like old photographs and things. And I would say that was really, really crucial to being able to try to write about something that I obviously didn't experience in a way that would have been hopefully accurate to what it was like. Great question. Also, I will say the Williams College Library, if you're interested in Whittlesea himself, they have a lot of his stuff, like any papers, and then also just stuff like his uniform, his helmet, his medals, things like that. Yeah, Elsa.
Yeah, I just want to say something because we have senior citizens on this panel here. And I particularly was very fascinated with World War II because my father was in the Philippines, in Manila during World War II. And just for resource information, I actually went to the War College in Pennsylvania and was able to get through his discharge, his actual infantry that he was in, and a complete write down of where they went and how they were disbanded and everything. And on top of that, while I was there, the guy told me, because I found a picture with my father in Manila, World War II, with a set of Puerto Ricans, because the Puerto Ricans were kept as a unit, because we were actually brought from Puerto Rico to here, and then they kept them together because of the food and all that. So he told me to go to Maryland. So I actually went to the archives in Maryland, and I was actually able to see the original picture that I found in a book that was taken, and there's a slew of information that people don't even know that they can get, like specifically if your father was an Army World War II veteran, they have the records, and you can go out there. Of course, like you said, you have to you're not allowed to bring certain things in. They have people looking over everything. And when I went to Maryland to the archives, I had to wear the white gloves to look at the pictures.
Yeah.
But I'm just letting people out there know that there is stuff out there if you want to find out about your parents if they were in World War II.
Thanks,
That's
Elsa. Marilyn has also written a book on World War I, a specific World War I soldier. So I'm going to connect.
Cool.
I'll connect the two of you later.
Awesome.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your poetry and your work as a publisher.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the poetry. Yeah, poetry, I write all genres, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, but I would say that poetry is my first love. When I was a little kid, that was the thing I started writing, and I still write it. And I would say the way that poetry is in my life most steadily these days is I do a activity called Poems While You Wait. And it's a group of many poets here in Chicago. There's like 25 of us now. And we all have manual typewriters, which probably is a familiar device and a device that I personally love. So we'll take our typewriters to a public place when it's safe, right? This is when it's not a pandemic, like a street festival or a museum. And we'll write poems for people on the spot. So we charge $5 a poem, which is very, very affordable. And you can give us any topic at all. Like you could give me the topic like archival research, and I would say, all right. And then you would give me like 10 minutes or one of the other poets 10 minutes. And in 10 minutes, we would like type up a poem for you on that topic on the spot and then give you the typewritten poem. And now, obviously we're sad to not be able to do it in person, although we hope to get back to it once it's safe. But we do have, our website, and we're doing it remotely, so people can, send us a request and we can do a poem that way. And we really like it because it's a great way to connect with strangers and write about stuff that we honestly wouldn't write about if we were not talking to strangers. So I feel like Poems While You Wait is a very, Lillian Boxfish kind of thing to do because it gets you to talk to randos, which I like. I like to talk to people on the street. And then it leads nicely into the second part of the question about being a publisher. So I run a small publishing company called Rose Metal Press, and we focus on work in hybrid genres, which is stuff like prose poetry or flash fiction or image and text or collaborative work. So work that we think is good and valuable and deserves to be published, but that probably is not going to be published by Penguin or Random House or something like that, because it's going to sell, but it's not going to sell on that level, but it can still find a good home. So we put out 2 books a year. We're very small, but our books get reviewed. We've been in the New York Times 3 times now. We've been around since 2006, and it still feels great to get a New York Times review, Publishers Weekly, Library Journal. And we work very closely with the authors to get their work in the best form possible to be received by readers. And so all the money that we earn for Poems While You Wait, if you're like, where does that $5 go? All the money goes to Rose Metal Press to put out books, because it costs a lot of money to put out a book. It's worth it, but it is expensive. The paper and the design and the distribution and all that stuff. So there's like a nice symbiosis going on there that I feel lucky to be able to do.
It's great. Do we have
Other
more
questions or comments?
How'd you come up with the name Lillian Boxfish?
Love that question. So yeah, probably other writers have this too, where you can spend a lot of time on your characters' names, partly because they're so important and also because it lets you procrastinate the harder part of, really writing. So I knew that I wanted to have, Margaret Fishback is kind of a funny name. With no disrespect to the lady herself, she knew it, right? In her letters, she would goof around. She's like, oh, fishback, it's goofy, it's a fish with a back, and she would like write little rhymes about it. So I loved that she had this sense of humor about herself. And so I wanted to give my character a name that could also have a similar comic potential that she could joke around with in some of her correspondence. And so it's not hard to go from Fishback to Boxfish. And then I wanted, Margaret is such a stately name, and it's, obviously from a different era slightly. I mean, it's not ancient, but it's a name that you don't hear as much. And so I wanted to find a similar name for her first name that would be authentic to the time period. And so this is a thing that, again, probably other writers know, but if you go to the Social Security Administration website, they keep track of all the baby names. And so you can search specific time periods. And I knew that I wanted my protagonist would have to have been born in 1899. And so you can go to a given year, a given decade, and see what like the top 50 baby names for boys and girls were. And so I did that. I just spent a ton of time thinking like, does this work? Does this work? And I was like, Lillian, because again, it has sort of a similar feel to me, to Margaret, where it's like a beautiful old name that, you just don't hear quite as much anymore. So yeah, so thanks for asking, because I spent a lot of time on that name.
I have another question about, do you have favorite quotes from your writings, from books? Do you remember certain quotes come to mind as your favorites?
That I've written, or?
Yes, because I read a lot of the reviews of your books, and everybody has different favorites.
Yeah.
And I have, but I wondered if you do.
Yeah, I think, thanks for asking. Yeah, I do. And I think there's stuff that, probably stands out to me because it's stuff that I think is true, or that I use to help myself, or that I've given a character because I want them to say what I think. So yeah. My favorite, in Lillian is probably, at one point she says, the point of living in the world is just to stay interested. And I like that. And I think that's my favorite, because I think, as long as you're interested, like even if you're a little dismayed, as long as you're interested, you'll probably get through to tomorrow, So I think I like that one a lot. And then I think, I don't know, I thought a lot about the first line of Cher-Ami and Major Whittlesey. I do this thing in the book where each chapter opens with a sentence that's the same. So Cher-Ami says something, and then Whittlesey says it. And, from there, they go into a very different account of their experience, but each chapter has the same thing. And the first sentence of the book is, monuments matter most to pigeons and soldiers, which I thought about a lot. And, I hope it sounds sad. I hope it sounds a little funny. I hope it's the kind of, I have this friend, Dale, who's in a book club with us, and he says it's like the Dale Panger first sentence test. He just made it up. He's just a guy, but he said that he knows that he's gonna enjoy a book or want to keep reading it if the first sentence causes him to ask more than one question. And so ever since Dale said that years ago, I'm like, I have to write a sentence that would make Dale keep reading. I'm like, Dale is my reader. So I felt like that was a sentence that Dale would like. And then the book club, my book club is lovely. They read my book, which is so nice of them. And he was like, it's a good first sentence. And I was like, Dale liked it.
What other books has your book club read, and what do you like to read? And when do you find time to read?
Yeah, oh yeah. So luckily I'm a really fast reader. I do a lot of book reviews. I think, book criticism is important, and I try to write reviews that are fun to read, even if you're like, I'm never going to read this book, but I enjoyed this 800-word review, so I try to do that. I personally like to read all different kinds of stuff. Like right now I'm reading this book, The History of Luminous Motion by Scott Bradfield. I would say my taste tends to run toward stuff that's a little older, and this is a book that came out in the 80s and it's out of print now. But it's so beautifully written. It's really upsetting. It's about a very disturbed child protagonist, but it's so beautiful, just on a sentence level. Like every line is poetry. And then in the book club, we tend to read more popular fiction, like more book club books. Like last month we read White Tears by Hari Kunzru, which I really liked and very much recommend. It's about these two guys in New York who run kind of a record label production company, and it's about sort of, it's really, I think, kind of about capitalism, but sort of about who, cultural appropriation and like Black music that's often, distributed by white distributors. And it's really good. It's kind of a thriller and a ghost story too. So it's like, it's got these great thinky ideas, but it's also honestly kind of like a trashy page turner. So it was like awesome. I loved it.
Yeah.
And then this month, we're reading American Dirt, because we wanted to see what all the what all the hullabaloo was about. So that's been very interesting because obviously that was a big book last year and not without controversy. So I appreciated the opportunity to sort of see like, what was that about? And then a book that like, I always love the New York Review of Books classics where they reissue old books. And they recently reissued this book, Basic Black with Pearls by Helen Weinsweg, who's a Canadian writer. And it's great. It's this like weird feminist spy novel where this woman, this isn't giving anything away. You find this out on the first page, but there's this woman who seems like she's just a contemporary, mild-mannered Canadian housewife in Toronto, but she has this secret lover named Conrad, who's like an international spy, and they leave messages for each other in the pages of National Geographic magazine as to like what cities they're going to go to and have their rendezvous. And that's all I'll say. It's just so weird and so funny, and so it's just so good. So I think Basic Black with Pearls is one of the best books I've read recently, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's so good.
It's great. I need to make a little commercial for the library here. I hate to take up your time with this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think most of you are on our email list, but if you're not, you should be, because we have, as demonstrated today, great programs that are really fun, and they go from everything from we have a program tomorrow on Black women's long struggle to freedom, to we're doing a program on Jeopardy, we're doing a program on Sinatra, we're doing the Negro Baseball League. We just have a whole range of historical, cultural, modern programs, and of course authors are the best. So if you haven't been on our newsletter list, please email me back with your address, your full name and your email address, and say, yes, please put me on that. A really simple way to do it is check out our website, which is new and beautifully designed, or our new Facebook page, which is also fabulous. And of course, here's the commercial to like us and follow us on Facebook. I want to just open up the few minutes we have left to other questions. Anyone? And Marilyn could stay on the line maybe, and Kathleen could stay on the line for a moment because you have to talk about to each other. And I could ask you 1,000 questions. I also grew up in the western suburbs. I also am an urban walker, and I'm a librarian. So there's so many ways that I feel, not only am I like Lillian, but I'm also like you, which I just love. And reading your books makes you feel so alive. So I want to thank everybody for participating today.
Yeah, thank you.
And coming in. And I hope to see you soon at another program. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was awesome. Thanks for spending part of your day with me.
Bye.
Bye.
So if you're not Marilyn or Catherine, please remove yourself. You could stay and listen to what Catherine's going to talk about. What I'm asking Marilyn to talk about is the other thing. And Marilyn, take it away.
So I'm very curious. What I pulled together was my father-in-law's letters. I call it a brush with history.
Yeah.
Letters 1918, 1919. And his mother saved everything, including his draft card 1917.
Wow.
And the reason why I knew about the Meuse-Argonne battle is he was with the 78th Division.
Oh, wow.
And they were the reserve to the Saint Mihiel battle, which was precursor to the Meuse-Argonne, which was the end.
Right.
So your story is right in that area.
Yeah.
The way I asked you the question was, because I self-published this.
Yeah.
I would love to get it to the repository. I knew about the World War I Museum.
Right.
So I was curious where other places, I mean, I would give it, obviously.
Yeah.
Just to have it places where people might research.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, here we have the, in Chicago, there's I think it's the Pritzker Military Research Library.
That's
so I think.
right. I forgot that.
Yeah. So I would do that, the Pritzker Research Library. And then I would also say just like any military libraries. I think different cities have different ones. And like the place that the other lady was talking about in Maryland, I would reach out, maybe even to like West Point and places like that and see if they would be interested. Because I think you're right. I think having that as an archival resource would be really helpful to people.
Certainly in New Jersey, everybody
Yeah.
isn't going to get it because he's a New Jersey person.
Yeah.
Through
Yeah. I would also consider reaching out to